All right, welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about user-defined structure types, or structs for short. So let's start talking about what is a struct. Well, up until now, we've been able to store data in what's called an array, but an array can only store the same amount of data, the same type of data. So you can have an array of integers or an array of doubles or an array of characters, but what structs allow you to do is they allow you to store data of different types of data in one all together that are related, and the name of that is called a struct. So let's start, for example, we can start to talk about a student. So if I wanted to define a student, like a student in my class, there's a bunch of different information about each student in my class. Like, for example, a student could have a last name. And to store the last name of the student, I would probably use a character array. And a student would have maybe a first name. And to store the first name of the student, I would also use a character array or a string. And a student might have a middle initial. And to store the middle initial, I would use a character. And maybe the student might have an ID. So to store the ID, I would use probably an integer. And another thing about a student could be a GPA, and I would probably use a double. Now, you're not limited to the amount of data that you want to store. You just have to decide what it is that you want to store, what type of variable you would use to store it, and you put it all together. So this is a student could have a lot more information than this, but just to keep it simple, we will just stick with these few items. All right, so what is that? How would I deal with that? Well, the way that you would deal with that, instead of having a separate array for the last name and a separate array for the first name and a separate integer for the ID, I can package it all together. And the way that I do that is I define a structure. So I use this keyword, typedef, type def, then struct. I have an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace, and then I decide what I want to name my structure, what I want to name my new data type. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm defining a new data type. So I would like to name mine student because that describes what it is. And then inside of here, I would put all the fields of information that define a student. So these are called the fields, and this is my new data type, which is called student. So I'm going to do it on the next slide so that I can show you the placement in the program. So up at the top of the program, you have your preprocessor directives. I'll just put one for now. You have pound include stdio.h. And then below your preprocessor directives, that's where you're going to define your structure. You're going to define your structure globally in your program so that it can be used throughout your whole program. So type def struct. And then inside, I'm going to have a character array for the last name. I'm going to have a character array for the first name. I'm going to have a character for the initial. That's just a single character. And I will also have an integer for the ID and a double for the GPA. So all of this information defines my structure. And once I've defined my structure globally at the beginning of my program, then I'm able to use this structure or instances of this structure throughout my program. So below that would be my function prototypes. And then below that would be my main function. Okay, so this is where, and then below that, of course, would be my function definitions would go below the main function. So once I've defined a structure, how many structures can I define in a program? As many as I need, but since this is introduction to structs, we're just going to have one struct. So now let's talk about how we would declare an instance of the struct. All right, so I forgot to put the name of my structure. The name of my structure is student, with a semicolon here at the end. So now what I've done is I've defined this new data type called student. So just in the same way that you declare an integer, you can now declare instances of student. So if I would like to declare an instance of student, I just put the new data type, student, and then I come up with a name. I can name my student, for example, I could name S1. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to have a student, I'm going to have an instance of student called S1. And that's all you have to do once you've defined it. Now, if I would like to define a student and initialize it, then I put my data type as student. And I can add declaration, initialize all the fields of my student. So I could put last name, Jones, first name, Tom, middle initial, C, ID, 456, GPA, 3.9. So obviously when I declare and I initialize, I need to declare and initialize in the order it's going to fill in the order that it's listed. So it's going to say, it's going to put the last name into the last name field, the first name into the first name field, the initial into the initial field, the ID into the ID field, and the GPA into the GPA field. Now, one thing I cannot do is you cannot later assign S1 equals, well, let's make another student. So let's have two students here. I have student S2 that I'm declaring, and S1. So S1 I'm initializing, S2 I'm just declaring. It is not okay to later say S2 equals Smith etc. It is, you cannot do that. So how are you going to deal with the fact of putting in the data into a student once you have already declared an instance of student? Well, the way that you do that is you go and you assign the information per field. So I'm going to go up here just because I'm out of space. And like I said before, you cannot assign it later on in the program. You can only assign it when it's declaration and initialization. This is initialization. So later I can use what's called the dot operator. It's just a dot or a period to access the field. So you use a dot operator, and with the dot operator you can access the fields in your instance of your student. In this case it's a student, whatever your new data type happens to be. So how do I do that? Well, I use the name. The way that you do that is you just go name dot field name. All right, so what are the fields names? Well, the name is the instance of the student. So S2 would be the name of the student, and the field name is going to be whichever one of these fields that I want to access. So for example, if I wanted to assign an ID to my student S2, all I would have to do is just go S2 dot ID equals 789. So right here, this is my name of my instance of student, and this right here is my field. And all I put in between is a dot to indicate that I'm dealing with my instance of student called S2, and I want to get into the field. Every time you declare an instance of a structure, you have all of the fields available to you. So another field, if I wanted to put the name, give it the last name, I would have to use the string copy function, string copy into s2.lname, which is a character array, the name Smith. So this is how you assign information into your instances of students. In the next video, we're going to get the information by user input.